Chapter 1. The Base at the Edge of Nowhere. The first time Kale Moraine heard the chains sing over the wind, he thought it was a misaligned antenna moaning in the gusts that forever scoured the flats of Anabasis Station. The desert out here sounded like a warehouse with ghosts, corrugate roof panels flexing, whirring bearings and old dish mounts, the tired sighs of hydrogen separators as they cooled at sundown. But this sound had teeth. It vibrated through the sand and into his boots, a metallic thrumming that seemed to count seconds like a failing heart. Kale paused mid-step, a wrench still in his glove, nose turned toward the ragged mesa where the base's first communication tower had been bolted into living stone a century earlier. The sun was low and copper. The heat coming off the ground smelled of tin and salt, and somewhere between the old tower's footings and the drop into shadow, the chains sang again, a long bow drawn across a jawed instrument, mournful and deliberate, as if something vast were shifting its weight against cold iron after a long time still. He almost turned back. The repair ticket blinking on his visor said the eastern condensers were starved again, and the hydroponics foreman had already used the word today 3 times in her message, which meant sooner than sing. Kale carried a second set of clothes in his truck, not because he liked to change, but because the greenhouses dumped humidity in waves thick enough to make him slick and sluggish. But the chain sang once more, tighter now, and an involuntary vision cut across his focus. A cargo rig, its air brakes shredded, skidding, a load swinging out on a chain that was never designed to bear such a cantilever until something gave and it all went bad. That feeling the mechanic's foreknowledge that a failure was imminent somewhere made him change course. He set his wrench on the dash, grabbed a coil of fiber rope, a portable welder, and a water flask, and trudged toward the mesa, the chain's voice guiding him in short phrases like a speaker with a dying battery. What he found at the base of the old tower was not a load or a rig or any human machine, but a creature too large to be ignored by physics and too exhausted to be fully present. She lay in a scooped hollow of sand where wind eddied around the stone buttress. Her scales, if scales they were, looked like lamellar ceramic plates nested over Myanmar cabling. Scorings ran in rows like maintenance hatches sealed long ago with glassy resin. Her wings, dear heavens. Wings were folded along her flanks, more sail than feather, monochrome sheets veined with glimmering lattice that caught the light the way solar fabric did, except these cloths had bones. Around her throat, below a narrow jaw bristling with sensor barbs that echoed whiskers, someone had cinched a collar as old as the first tower. The chain from that collar ran up into an eye bolt, disappeared behind a stone lip, and then snaked down again, anchored to a cold-forged post set years ago when labor had been cheaper than empathy. The collar's inner surface was discolored a dark, sticky brown where it met flesh. 2 of the plates near her forelimb were dented inward. Old burns patterned the membranes of her wings in therapy grid rectangles. This was an engineered being, the old stories made manifest, a drake, a war WIREM, a starborn guardian. She was also very much in pain. Kale stood there for a long count of 10, counting breath to keep from moving fast, because moving fast around wounded animals tends to register as attack. He eased his visor up so she could see eyes and cheekbones and sweat, and not a mirrored face. "Hey," he said, and the desert made the word small at first, and then carried it into her hollow with a second breath. "Hey there." One of her pupils dilated like a camera iris, then the other, focusing past him at the tower, and then down his chest. She inhaled, and the suction of that breath hoovered the sand into furrows. A faint overlay crackled on her throat, a panel waking. Kale lifted his hands to show he had no weapon, only tools. The panel stuttered in a dialect of machine code modulated into low speech. He caught maybe 3 words: inquiry, water, and release. That last one fell like a hammer on his conscience because the chain had rust built into it by design. He could see the brown rot around each link, the galvanic pitting where salt and time had dined. Someone wanted the restraint to last, but wanted it to fight back when challenged. A release would require not only severing steel, but solving an intention. He circled, slow, scanning. The collar had microtorques countersunk behind layered armor. The set pattern looked familiar in an architectural way. Nested locks that required power, then a key, then a ritual. Rituals he could do. Keys he could fabricate if he understood their teeth. Power he could bring. He stepped to the chain's anchor and tested it with one palm. The chain sang again, once, the collar pinching her throat anew. She didn't flinch. She watched him a little like a person in a dentist's chair watching choices narrow, jaw set, eyes unblinking, trusting a stranger because the alternative was worse. "I'm Kale," he said, "because names are circuits that close. Engineer. I fix things. You look like a thing that needs fixing. Can you understand?" The panel in her throat warmed to a deeper red. A voice like cooling fans came through a weak speaker. "Understand. Thirst. Years." He swallowed hard because there was dust in his mouth, and also because something in that single word years spooled out the math of cruelty. "Water first," he said. "Then the rest." He unslung his flask, and then, considering volume, his whole hydration pack, and then, considering dignity, set both down just out of reach and backed away 4 steps. "I'm going to slide this to you." She nodded, which was a terrifying geometry as plates and tendons and light flexed in concert, but her motion was small and careful. He pushed the container with a boot, her 4-claw 3 forward talons with a hitching retractable 4th hooked, and dragged it inward. When she drank, the sound was both meadow quiet and industrial, a great bellows pulling liquid through 1,000 tiny pores. Her throat plate lightened. She exhaled, and the breath smelled like wet stone after rain. Questions came uninvited. Who did this? Why here? What did they want? But the collar's power indicator answered one. Someone had tied her here because the tower was a power source. The collar's charging band had been painted to blend with the stone and run right up under the tower's service conduit. A whisper of inductive charge trickled down to keep the lock awake. It would need an interruption. "I think I can do this," Kale said. "But I'm going to have to cut power, and the greenhouse foreman will say unrepeatable things if she loses her comms. So we're going to do this fast, and then I'm going to have to talk even faster. If you can, when the chain relaxes, don't pull. We'll take it off, not break it." She angled her head, and something like a smile lived for a second in the fold where jaw met throat. "Trust," she said, and he exhaled a laugh that sounded like a man who had not been believed in a while. He jogged up the old maintenance ladder, cursing each rung as it bit his palms through the gloves, and found the service panel he'd hoped was still there from the first installation. The tower hummed with age. He killed the induction line. When he did, the desert went momentarily quiet, as if a mosquito had finally stopped whining near his ear. He heard the collar's motors sigh into sleep. "Now," he said, and slid back down, boots squealing, heart tight. At the base, he knelt by the collar and set his welder to the lowest notch that would still bite, kissed the bead across the seam while praying he wasn't about to bake skin. The device fought him once, twice, then abruptly gave up its hinge like a stubborn door in a damp house. Kale levered the jaw apart with a pry bar, saw the red gouge it had left on her neck, swore quietly, then slipped the collar free and dropped it into the sand. It didn't thud like steel. It hit like malice made heavy. For 5 seconds they did not move. Then she inhaled and the breath did not catch. The wings unspooled a fraction and the chain slithered toward the ground as if ashamed. Kale backed away to give her sky. He fought the urge to pump a fist and shout like a kid who'd finally unstuck a seized bolt. Anything that loud would be wrong in this new cathedral. Instead he said, "There," and then, after a pause in which he remembered his manners, "Do you have a name?" She closed her eyes halfway, and for a moment he saw how old she truly was, not in rust or failing servos, but in attention, the way scholars stare at old light. "VYR," she said. "Last of the Sable Thermals. Exiled. Bound. And now dash." She flexed her forelimbs. Chains rang. Unchained. The wind tugged the words away and returned with grit. Kale suddenly felt the cold of evening in his damp shirt and the geometry of what came next. A being larger than any skimmer he'd serviced, newly freed, injured, hungry, possibly carrying entire libraries of ML-trained reflexes about humans. He also saw, with the clarity fatigue sometimes brings, that no one else would help her if he didn't. There were plenty of men on Anabasis who loved old stories about dragons until they had to pay for one's feed. "I run a hangar," he said. "It leaks. Everything I own leaks. But it's dry, and there are winches and medkits and things that fix other things. Come with me, if you can walk." VYR tested the sand beneath one limb, then another, stood, and the base of the tower sank an inch as if pleased to be allowed to settle at last. She took one step and then two. The chain dragged behind like a dead snake until Kale looped it, cut it, and left the rust there as an offering to entropy. When they crested the last rise before the hangar, the desert had already taken back their footprints behind them. Ahead, the cracked doors of Bay 3 waited like dry lips. Chapter 2. The Hangar with the Leaking Roof. The hangar did not so much receive VYR as encounter her. The way an old barn meets a storm, it was not built to survive, but endures anyway by stubbornness and memory. The truss beams groaned as she ducked her head and threaded the wings through like delicate sails. Kale heard bolts shifting against Agenod, what he hadn't replaced because parts were scarce and coin scarcer. Dust avalanched from rafters and highlighted the line of her back like a comet trail. He breathed through the impulse to apologize for the poverty of his hospitality and focused instead on the sequence of triage. Stop the bleeding, secure the airway, stabilize the spine, translated now into welds and tendons, membranes and heat exchangers, a living machine. He guided her to the widest bay, swept a heap of shock absorbers to one side with his boot, and switched on every lamp. The light warmed her scales into something nearer bronze. He could see the score marks left by the collar on her throat and the deeper dents in her flank where blunt trauma had buckled plate. He wanted to rage at whoever had done that, but anger does not torque a wrench more true. So he fetched a trolley and laid his kit out like a ritual. Fiber sutures, resin patch, sterile wash, micronutrient slurry that had kept half the local diggers alive during the drought. VYR lay down with an old sailor's care, tail coiling around her as if to keep the heat in, and lowered her head onto a stack of shipping foam. There is an intimacy to repair that Kale had never learned to share with lovers. Machines required confession and response. A question asked with a magnet, an answer given with a voltage tick, a pattern discerned from harmonics. VYR answered more frankly than any aircraft. When he cleaned the gouge under her jaw, she tensed, and then released the tension sawtooth by sawtooth until the wash ran clear and the smell of iron faded. When he lifted her wing to see where the therapy grid had bit, she cooperated, and he saw, traveling underneath the scorched lattice, a river of fiber optics that carried both signal and something like mood. At the first application of resin patch, the lights under the membrane cooled 2 shades, nerves registering relief. He spoke as he worked, not because he needed to tell her what he was doing, though he did, in case she needed the comfort of consent, but because the human voice laid a floor across which he could walk without looking down too long. He told her about Anabasis Station and the power ration and the way the world had ended twice already in his lifetime, but still insisted on taxes. He told her about the hydroponics foreman who threatened to throw him out of the greenhouse when he came in smelling like skimmer grease, but who had also left him a crate of strawberries on his birthday that time. He told her about the corpse of an old shuttle that he had kept not because it would fly again, but because some broken things teach you patience. VYR, when her breath was steady enough to shape more than one word at a time, told him about a night even the desert had not forgiven. Her clan sable thermals, a name that sounded like a weather pattern married to an anthem, had served, once, as guardians of orbital elevators and shepherds of cargo pods through magnet storms. They were not constructs, not in the way a tank is a construct. They were heritable mind wound around engineered bodies, names passing like coins down a long table. The war that ended first had ended them second. Someone who wanted a monopoly on gravity had rewritten the contracts and starved the rest with fines. Dragons could drink fire, but not paperwork. Her clan had dwindled to a handful, then a brood, then a name. They had come to the mesa because it was low power and hot wind, and because an old hatch in the tower whispered in their coils of home. One of theirs had betrayed them, she said, voice almost too quiet for the hangar to hold. A young one, fearful, cutting deals with men who promised maintenance in exchange for obedience. The collar had been described as a safeguard, to keep you safe from yourselves. She had laughed. We are the safety, she had said, and they had smiled like priests. Impact, sirens, anesthetics in the fog. She woke to the chain. Kale felt the old anger return, but now it had somewhere to go. He cataloged the punctures like a bookbinder noting foxing, counted rib plates like slats in a fence, slid the dermal mesh in where the ceramic had parted, teased the edges together with bond lace, and a prayer. He did what good mechanics do. He listened for what was not said by the body. When he held the scanner over her core, the image on his pad almost stopped his heart. VYR's inner furnace was not a simple heat exchanger like the spin core of a thruster. It was a prismatic array of metamaterials arranged in a chrysanthemum of focusing petals around a seed that hummed at a frequency that had never been written into any of his manuals. It looked less like a reactor than a vow. He touched the pad with 2 fingers to expand the image and saw around that core a halo of something that wanted to be more than heat. Coherent output in a frequency range that reminded him of the way the early towers had sung when sun struck perfect angle. She felt his change in breath and, without opening her eyes, said, "Do not be afraid of my fire." He laughed then, not from mockery, but from a human smallness beside what is beautiful. "I'm not," he said. "I'm afraid of having to go back to repairing condensers after this." Night came, a chill slinking along the floor, and the leaks in the roof marked their places by dripping faintly into old oil pans he kept for the purpose. Cale threw an emergency tarp over the blades of a disassembled fan and spread a rough blanket across the foam beneath VYR's jaw. He cooked for them both on a single induction plate. Brown rice, canned greens, a little cooked protein for him, and for VYR a slurry of minerals and sugar water that he warmed to body temp and fed into her esophageal port with a humility that put him near tears. The act of feeding a thing that could burn a hole through the roof felt, in that hour, like a sacrament. When he lay down finally between a stack of crates and the bay door, he could not sleep. He watched her slow respiration, the wings' edges rising and falling like the tide, and felt an emotion he had not earned the right to name settle at the base of his throat. He woke toward morning to the soft scraping sound of something being dragged across the floor. He came up fast, thinking intruder, wrench in hand, only to see VYR leaning painfully toward the corner where he slept, her talons hooked in an old tarp. She nudged it toward him because the night had grown cold, and he had no better blanket. He could not bear that kindness, and so pretended to fuss with a lamp. "We should talk," he said, to both avoid crying and to do something that looked like a plan. "About next steps. About what it means that you're here. There are people who will be angry at choices I've made. There is a foreman who is going to have my hide if the tower doesn't hum by sunrise. There is a young fool somewhere who thinks collars keep anyone safe. But there is also this, a hangar with a leaking roof, a lonely mechanic, a dragon who deserves better stories. If you rest, and you should we can, when you're stronger, leave this place or fix it or burn down whatever needs burning. I'll take the heat." VYR opened one eye, bright as an instrument panel spun up after a long maintenance cycle. "You speak like a man who has preferred repair to war," she said. "Good. There will be need for both. And for songs. We have none left." He swallowed and nodded. "Sleep," he said. "We'll write one when you wake." Chapter 3. The Sky Knows the Name of Who Comes. The rumble rolled in mid-morning, low and insistent, like a thundercloud that remembered it was a machine. Cale heard it through the hangar's skin before his instruments confessed. In the seconds before the radar woke, he understood something elemental. Someone had come who believed they owned the horizon. The scope affirmed with blunt pixels. 8 signatures fanned in skirmish formation, altitude low enough to smell the dust, transponders anonymized in a way that screamed authority. Over the flat band, a voice lilted with officious boredom. "Anabasis Bay 3, prepare to receive inspection. Open your doors, secure all assets, stand clear. No source, no IFF, no legal disclaimers. Predators wearing police uniforms." VYR lifted her head from rest and inhaled with a sound like a forge drawing breath. The patch lines along her wing glowed faintly where he'd laid resin. She tested the hinge of her forelimb and winced only a little. "They've come for me," she said, not with fear but with the tired flatness of those who have calculated odds so often that numbers taste like chalk. Cale took a breath and caught metallic tang on the air that he recognized from drills, the ions of charged weaponry. "How do you want to play this?" he asked, because it mattered to him that her agency be the first decision. "I can barricade. I can talk. I can stall. I can blow something vital and crime maintenance until we die." VYR's pupils narrowed into hunting slits, but her tone remained seminar calm. "We do not fight in this room," she said. "Your roof will not forgive it. Nor should we give the spectacle they came to record. It is their theater. We will choose a stage of our own." Kale nodded, then moved like a man in a familiar emergency. He snapped open the breaker to spin up the hoist motors, not for hoisting, but to give the hangar's hungry circuits an excuse to drink amperage. He cut the main door's auto control and swapped in a manual bar so no one outside could flick a switch and turn his life into a garage sale. He pulled 2 old rocket-rated fire blankets from storage and slung them over a line so they could be dropped fast if there was heat. He marked in his head 3 places where load-bearing beams could be selectively compromised to produce convincing failure if he needed to send a roof down as a wall. And then he did the most subversive thing a mechanic can do. He repaired, quickly, something that had been left broken for a week because nobody had assigned a ticket: the emergency deluge valve in the sprinkler system. If they tried to cook his home, he would drown their fire with recycled greenhouse water that smelled like basil and survival. The knock on the bay door was not a knock at all. It was the coupling of magnetic grapples. The metal rang and hummed as fields aligned. "Open," the voice outside said, and the fact that the voice did not say please told Kale everything he needed to know about the day he was about to have. He walked to the control podium, lifted the dead, obviously disconnected switch to make a show for the outside cameras, and called back. "It's stuck. Been stuck for years. Needs time to spin the racks." He could almost hear the sigh of the impatient, and he allowed himself a petty grin before setting his jaw. He looked to VYR. She had pulled herself into the shadow near the back, under the mezzanine where he kept parts that would never find their way home. Tension sharpened the lines of her. "They have dampers for my fire," she said, "and nets for my wings. The first act will be a warning shot. Then magnanimity. Then escalation. They do not expect a mechanic to understand their scripts." Kale exhaled. "I've read worse scripts. Wait for my cue." He threw the manual bar. The door stuttered up half a meter and then jammed the way he had planned, just enough for a mast to lean under and a camera to blink at him like a curious insect. He wiped his hands on his coveralls for effect and stepped into the slice of sunlight, blinking like a man not used to stars. Outside, the sky was crowded. Skimmers hovered at fan down. Men and women in shock gray suits hung in harnesses like impatient fruit. The one in front had a badge that was either a star or a gear. He wore a smile the way a knife wears polish. "Mr. Moraine," the official said, and Kale wanted to laugh because they had the wrong last name and could not be bothered to get it right. "We have a report of a dangerous asset in your possession. We are authorized to remove it for community safety and to provide you a modest stipend for its transfer. Think of it as a burden relieved." Kale scratched under his eye deliberately, the universal gesture of the grease-stained man considering paperwork. "A stipend," he said, as if tasting a new spice and trying to decide if it was poison. "I've been owed stipends that turned into fines. Who exactly authorizes you, and how did you come by the concept of community?" The grin did not shift. "Let's not be difficult." He knew then that talk would stall, but not shift the script. He also knew that if they got line of sight on VYR while she was still weak, it would be a net and a tranquilizer and a crane. He looked past the official's shoulder as if noticing something new and frowned. The official's own reflexes made him half-turn, and that gave Kale the heartbeat he needed to press the button in his pocket that cut the grapple field by spiking it with noise. The door groaned like an old animal and slammed shut, not out of revolt, but because that was what it had been told to do. The official startled, the skimmers readjusted, and for a moment the script lost its page and shuffled. Kale spoke into that gap, voice pitched not for the outsider but for the inside. "Ready." VYR moved without noise, which should not have been possible at her size but was. She slid along the shadow until her wings had enough clearance and then unfurled 1/3 of their span. Kale dropped the blankets from the line. In that steady orange light, her membranes looked less like sails and more like the inside of a cathedral window, shot through with faint, coherent glow where her cores sent tight beam frequencies humming toward some memory of stars. She was still not strong enough for extended flight. Kale did not need flight. He needed theater. He threw the manual bar again, hard, and the door surged up to a full meter, then 2, stalling at a height that gave outside cameras a half view of an enormous eye staring down the aperture like a myth inconvenienced. The official brave or foolish leaned in to look. It was the look that undid him. VYR's eye did not speak of rage. It spoke of sadness old as burnt treaties. The official dropped his grin. Kale, in the same moment, pulled a second switch that brought the deluge to bear not inside but out. Water hammered down through the external sprinkler grid he had pretended never to have repaired, drenching the skimmers, fouling the net casters, shorting exposed dampers designed to drink fire but not drink basil stinking rain. Cease. The voice snapped, but the script had lost a second page now. Cale stepped into the rain and pointed at the badge that was either star or gear. Your authorization is wet, he said, and as childish as the line played in his ear, it did something to the men who had come to be righteous. They looked like cats dropped into a bath. One of them fired a warning shot, a sustained arc of blue ion that etched glass across the hangar door, but the water ate its fringe and left only a halo. VYR moved again, wings unfolding another span, and the air inside the bay felt suddenly full of meaning, as if a choir had inhaled to sing but had not yet chosen a song. Cale counted beats, not seconds, waited for the instinct that fixes engines and also fixes stories, and then called to the official in a voice that had carried across factory floors during strikes. We'll talk. But not here. 20 minutes. At the base of the old tower with the rust where your friends left it. He stared hard, knowing that bullies loved an audience and hated to be asked to meet in a place where old wrongs had names. The official, dripping and furious, wiped his face and misread what was in front of him as a negotiation. 15, he shot back, and because it mattered, Cale said, 18, which is the number of adulthood in places that have not forgotten sunrise. He closed the door with a slam that felt like drawing a line in chalk. Inside, his hands shook. VYR's did not. You make small magics, she said. Enough to bend the first act. He sagged against the nearest crate and let the adrenaline leak out. They'll come back with better toys, he said, and a script with fewer stage directions. Can you walk that far? She tested the wing again and grimaced, but her voice held iron. I can stand in the place where they chain me. I can breathe there without the memory of your roof. And if they bring nets, I prefer to tear them under the sky. They left together through the back, into a light wind that had rinsed the air clean. Cale carried more than he should have: bolt cutters, a patch thrower, a satchel with spare fuses, because bringing too little to a confrontation never ends in poetry. VYR carried herself. As they approached the mesa, Cale saw it again, the ring of sand where her body had worn a shape into the world. He felt apology gather in his mouth like rain clouds, but did not speak it. Apologies are for after safety. They waited in the lee of the stone. It took 11 minutes for the skimmers to arrive, and another 2 for someone to grow the courage to step onto ancient ground. The official returned without the grin. He carried a tablet and a baton that hummed at a pitch that made Cale's back molars ache. The camera on his shoulder watched like a careful god. He began, as bullies do, with the preface that makes cruelty sound like math. Asset VYR, he said. You were bound by the Emergency Custodial Directive of Year 94, updated Year 117, Article 5, by which all parabiological hazards are to be responsibly contained pending evaluation. We are here to resume protective custody. No harm will come to you if you comply. VYR's laugh made the baton's pitch wobble. Words, she said. You have built a house out of words, and hope none of us remember the fire. Cale had planned to speak second. He interrupted because plans are for days when scripts are honest. She is not an asset, he said, voice level. She is a person. She is injured. She was left to die here. You may have articles and updates. I have a hangar and a welder and a community that will not help you when your damper's short again, because everyone loves their strawberries. Walk away. The official gestured and the skimmers lifted 2 meters, nets half unfurled, O-rings like black halos. No, he said. But there was a quiver in it, a man whose script had lost its last page and who could not improvise. VYR stirred, and the temperature around them lifted the way a hand stove warms a tent. You were children, she said, the words unkind only because they were unarguably true. We carried your freight through storm and gravity's teeth. We oriented your cities to the sun for best heat. We stood over your elevators while your wars burned under us, and did not choose a side, because you asked us not to. And when your lawyers came, we went hungry. And when your engineers died, we watched your replacements arrive with fear in their pockets and leashes. I am tired. She could have burned them then. She did not. She exhaled, and the air in front of her shimmered like heat on road, and the first net the skimmers cast turned in that shimmer and folded upon itself, as if ashamed, collapsing around the rotor of its own parent, bringing his craft down so gently it felt like forgiveness. The official flinched and raised the baton. Kale stepped forward, deliberately between the baton and VYR, because sometimes the work is not to fix but to be in the way. The official's eyes found him, as if noticing him for the first time as a human with a face rather than a grease stain with an invoice. And in that strange clarity, Kale felt something like pity. This man had been taught a single theater in which names like asset and directive were furniture. He did not know how to stand in wind and be wrong. The baton's hum rose. It would fire in one heartbeat. Kale did not have a weapon that would matter. He had a satchel of fuses. He threw the satchel. It hit the baton, and the baton did what machines do when they are struck with a bag of unexpected conductive components in a rain-wet world. It threw its temper tantrum into itself and died. The official stared at the smoking husk in his hand, and then, like a man in an old story, did the only thing left to him. He blew a whistle. More skimmers lifted. VYR's wings opened fully now, scars lit like constellations, and the tower behind her hummed for the first time in years, as if remembering the weight of guardianship. The wind changed. The sky knew the name of who came. And then, instead of war, something else occurred, something Kale would not find a word for until much later when language had recovered its breath. VYR sang. It was not a song like humans sing, though music lived in it. It was a declaration in harmonics and pressure changes, in precise modulations of thermal gradients. It turned the space between the skimmers and the ground into a medium where violence would have to ask permission to travel. The nets could not maintain their logic in that medium. Their mesh forgot how to be taught and became ribbon. The dampers bled their stored potential into a harmless braiding of steam. The skimmers drifted as if caught in a tide they had not planned to measure. The official stepped backward, not because a dragon had threatened him, but because physics had failed to obey his paperwork. And that is the first betrayal any bureaucracy remembers. He lowered his whistle. He looked at Kale. For a heartbeat, Kale thought he saw, behind the badge and the training, a person who might have preferred repairs to scripts. Then the moment passed. This is not over, he managed, something in him needing a line that sounded like a line. And Kale, because he was tired and because the desert dislikes waste, said, "It can be." They left without victory music, the way weather leaves. The skimmers rose. The nets hung limp. VYR furled her wings and let the heat bleed back into the morning. Kale stood with his palms damp and his mouth dry and his heart pounding like a piston in a car too old to pass inspection, and then, because labor resists poetry, he said, "We need to fix your right forejoint before the next time. And I need to restore power to the tower before Aunt Kessa in hydroponics comes after me with a hoe." VYR blinked at him once, not unkindly. "We will," she said, and together they walked back to the leaking roof that had become a temple. Chapter 4. The Furnace and the Field. The days that followed did not glow with triumph. They smelled of epoxy and hot dust, and the slow, stubborn breath of living through. VYR's healing was work, not miracle. Careful flexion, incremental reinforcement of plates with bonded ceramic that matched her body's coefficient of expansion so that heat would not shiver the patch free. A gradual ramping of fuel mix as her core recalibrated to something like readiness. The hangar became a workshop for a species of one. Kale learned more than he had any right to learn about a furnace that had been built by minds also singular. How the petals of the core opened and closed not only to generate heat, but to hide a seed. How the seed encased a lattice less like a crystal and more like a story, a set of constraints that could be tuned to produce not only thermal coherence, but something that tasted like permission. At night, when exhaustion made him honest, he would sit under her wing with his back against a crate and ask aloud to an empty bay if perhaps what power had always been, at the best of times, was consent physics consenting to behave because you had asked politely in the language of boundary conditions, beings consenting to be protected because you had earned their trust, a dragon consenting to share her fire because a mechanic had earned her name. Word leaked, because it always does. Some came offering help, which was awkward at first because Anabasis Station was not a culture that had practice in helping large mythic beings integrate into zoning. Aunt Kessa from hydroponics arrived with 2 bushel crates of something that looked like barley, but wasn't, and a stern lecture about taps. A quiet couple from the far solar array brought spools of cable and denied they had cried when they saw the chain prints under the tower. An old man who had once flown drones during the war came with a tin of engine butter and told Kale, eyes on the floor, that he had done terrible math in his youth and had come to swear fealty to whoever was doing better arithmetic now. Kale accepted the gifts and the fealty and then put them all to work because labor is the language of belonging. They stitched a community that had not expected to be won around a dragon who had expected to die. The bureaucrats did not return as a swarm. They returned like paperwork, quietly, through channels, with notices tacked to doors and fines that came in triplicate along with offers of amicable settlement. They rerouted power for an afternoon to test whether starved hangars broke their oaths. Kale compensated by plugging the hangar into HFY's core through a coupler he designed that he called the Mercy Loop, which skinned the dragon's pressure pulses into a trickle of clean current that could light a town. He did not brag about it. He hid it under conduit he labeled fans. When men with badges came to inspect, the fans were warm enough to convince. When they left, the greenhouse lights came back up and the strawberries resumed their pink. It would have been a good ending. Quiet resistance, a convalescing dragon, a mechanic learning the harmonies of consent if not for the thing Kale had almost but not quite noticed in the scan the first night. At the core's heart, beneath the petals, the seed had hummed at a frequency he could feel in the bones of his wrist, but not name. Now, as HFY grew stronger, the hum changed timbre. It was not a problem, not in the sense that problems are loose bolts. It was a development, like the way a bridge acquires a tone as trucks cross it. HFY felt it too. She grew alert in ways that were not painful. She asked fewer questions about breakfast and more about Horizon. One evening, late, she asked for the lights to be lowered and for the big doors to be opened, not all the way, just enough to let the wind speak. He obliged. She lay very still then, heat folded deep, listening to something far. Kel did not ask what. He had learned the virtue of silence when something holy is happening. After a long time, she said, he lived. Kel waited. Who? He asked, when waiting turned from virtue to collaboration. The one who betrayed us, she said, and the sentence rang with neither joy nor spite. There is another song. Not far. Wounded as I was, but not bound. He calls now because he has learned the price of fear. Her voice did not harden. It softened in a way that made Kale realize she carried more years than the station's rust. I would go, she said. Not to punish. To end a long story well if I can. Kale stood then in the doorway and looked out at the desert and the tower and the memory of the chain, and then back at the wing that had sheltered him when sleep lost its courage. And he said, because he could not say anything else and still be himself, then we go. They went at dawn, a time when a dragon's shadow is long and a mechanic's courage has not yet had time to read the news. HFY could not fly far or high, but she could leap and glide, and then run, long, low strides that ate ground like old trains eating distance. Kale rode a skimmer he had not filed paperwork for, its battery topped by the Mercy Loop, its seat modified with a backrest because he had started to admit he was mortal. They traveled toward the ridgeline that marked the old fireway, where the first fights of the First War had left vitrified scars in red glass. As they approached the canyon mouth, the air took on the timbre of another furnace. It was not as clean as HFY's. It had the ragged roughness of a generator tuned for speed and then asked for years. They found him if him is the word on a shelf of stone where wind wrote equations no one solved. He was smaller than HFY by a third, the way younger siblings often are, with plates that had not been allowed to thicken and a wing torn long ways by something that had not loved its work. He raised his head as they approached, and his eye, only one still clean, the other clouded by a burn, found HFY, and then dropped to Kale, because stories now apparently included humans, and the world is nothing if not generous with plot twists. HFY did not roar. She did not hiss. She stopped a respectful distance away and laid her head on the sand. Aaron, she said, and Kale understood that names, in their culture, were offered like water. The smaller dragon shuddered, not from fear, but from the weight of luck. I am sorry, he said, the apology slipping between his teeth as if it had lived there for a decade. They said dash. He stopped because the rest did not matter. HFY lifted her head. They said you would be safe if you delivered us. That they would maintain you. that they would honor an old contract with new clauses. Yes, I know. We all have sold ourselves once to fear. It is life after that sale that matters. Aaron did not know yet how to accept forgiveness, so he looked at Cale instead, as if asking for the price of admission to this revised universe. Cale, who had been poor long enough to hate tickets, stepped forward with his hands open as he had once done in a different desert. I'm Cale, he said. I fix things. If you want, I can fix you. I will also speak badly of you to your face when you deserve it. Aaron huffed, and the huff blundered into something like a laugh. They brought him home the way you bring home a storm. Cautiously, with respect, with tarps ready in case the roof remembers it was always meant to leak. VYR coached him in a language of heat that Cale could feel in his gums. Cale coached him in the etiquette of hanging cords back on their hooks and not stepping on forklift tines. Aunt Kessa came by and pretended to have always expected twins. The couple from the solar array built a second Mercy loop and named it after their dead dog, because grief will find a place to live if you give it power to light. Anabasis Station, which had not previously been good at community except when the power went out or the water ran low, found itself good at it now for reasons no one could write standards for. The notices on doors kept arriving. The fines kept multiplying like rabbits that had found grain. Cale ignored most of them, paid a few trivial ones to keep the dance plausible, and used the rest to insulate a draft in the office because bureaucracy is sometimes most useful when it knows it's being repurposed. When the final test came, it did not come with skimmers. It came with a letter that used the word warrant in a sentence where the word mercy used to live. It came with names of judges who had not stepped outside in a decade and a list of assets to be seized that included Bay 3, the tower, and anything described as a parabiological hazard. It came with the old young man, the official, without his smile, arriving walking instead of hovering, his badge in his pocket, his eyes tired. He stood in the door with his hat in his hands like a character from a different genre. Cale looked up from a bench where he was coaxing a motor back into wanting to spin. VYR raised her head. Aaron paused mid-chew on a coil he had been asked not to chew. The man cleared his throat. I came to tell you they're coming tomorrow with a writ, and with people who aren't me, he said. And that if you run tonight, the town will look the other way because the tower will malfunction at dawn. I'm not brave, and I'm not a good man. But I'm not interested in watching a story end badly when we could pick a different page. It is hard to accept help from the hands that hurt you. It is sometimes harder to deny it when it is cleanly offered. Cale waited for VYR to speak because that was the only language he cared to use now. She exhaled. Thank you, she said, and did not make a sermon of it. She looked to Cale. We go, she said, and Cale nodded because he had already packed the tools he could not bear to abandon and had already said silent goodbye to the leaks he had learned by heart. He looked at the hangar one last time the way a man looks at a room he finally feels safe in just as he chooses to leave it. He pressed his palm to the mezzanine pillar and felt the vibration of the Mercy loop humming like a lullaby. He left a note for Aunt Kessa that said only, "The fans are labeled wrong. You'll figure it out." He shut the doors not to lock them, but to keep the dust from making the place feel forgotten too soon. They left under a sky that had the color of a polished wrench. VYR could fly now, not high, but enough to keep her feet from the worst stones. Aaron ran, cautious at first, then with a joy that made Cale's throat ache. The official no badge, just a man with a name they did not ask, walked with them to the edge of town, and then stopped, hat twisting in his hands. I'll tell them you head north, he said. You should go south. Cale, in a spasm of a generosity he suspected he would regret and cherish all his life, stepped forward and hugged the man with one arm, leaving grease on his coat. You'll do better arithmetic, he said, and the man, to his own surprise, laughed like a kid. South was salt flats, and then scrub, and then the old riverbed where the world had cracked and forgotten to mend. They traveled by night when the air was kind and rested by day under overhangs that remembered lake. VYR sang sometimes to teach Aaron the harmonics that turned nets shameful. Cale listened and understood a little, and designed in his head a version of the Mercy loop you could carry like a book and then wrote it in the air with his finger before sleep. They crossed into a valley where wind-carved hoodoos stood like pillars in an abandoned temple, and found a community already there, a ring of tents around a collapsed elevator base. A strew of children who had never seen a dragon, and therefore did not yet know to fear what they should instead respect. The elders came with careful steps and hands empty. They looked from VYR to Aaron to Kale and did not ask for proofs. "We have water," one said. "We have work." Kale laughed then and had to sit down, his knees suddenly remembering every bolt he had ever tightened and every night he had made bargaining prayers to small parts. "We have repairs," he said, "and we have a story." And that is how the ending chose them. Not with fanfare, not with war, with a long valley where the wind had written permission into the stone and where men and women who were tired of being assets learned to be neighbors by mending membranes and scaffolds side by side. With Aaron learning patience the way young things do by failing, being scolded, and failing better. With VYR teaching, not like a queen, but like a teacher in a shop class who knows you can crack your thumb if you don't stand right, who holds your wrist and taps you twice and then steps back, trusting. With Kale building mercy loops and teaching children that power asked politely will say yes more often than power shouted at. With Aunt Kessa arriving one morning with a truck full of strawberries and a ledger book and a curse for the road dust and a kiss for Kale's cheek that made him blush. With notices still coming for a while and then stopping because paperwork is a crop that needs watering by fear and the rain had moved on. On a night late in the first winter, when frost traced the edges of the tents with delicate warnings and the stars looked like fresh bolts in a clean tray, Kale climbed the slope above camp with a blanket and a thermos and sat in the lee of a stone to watch the dragons sleep. VYR lay curled with her head toward the entrance, an old guardian's habit. Aaron sprawled like a teenager, all angles, one wing draped over half the fire pit and the other touching the Mercy Loop tower, as if to keep the current honest. Kale sipped coffee gone lukewarm and thought about beginnings. He had wanted once to be the kind of man whose name people shouted in wiring diagrams. He had become instead the kind of man who knew the leak by the sound it made, and the knot of fear tied itself into in a young dragon's throat when men in badges said asset. He knew, with the quiet that comes when work is honest, that this was better than what he had thought he wanted. He lay back then, blanket up, and looked at the sky until the stars blurred into a single, kind light. Below him, the Mercy Loop kept time. Beside him, the valley kept its faith. In the distance, wind stroked the tower that had once been a gallows until it hummed, at last, like a bell rung to call people not to war or to court, but to dinner. And if, somewhere out beyond the flats, in the quiet places where paper goes to die and treaties go to nap, a notice still exists that describes a parabiological hazard named VYR to be retrieved at once, it can sleep there. We have work. We have water. We have a dragon who sings nets in his shame. We have a mechanic who knows the sound a chain makes when it's about to fail and chooses, over and over, to walk toward it. We have, in the end, a small magics that, done often and with friends, looks like a miracle. That is how stories end when you refuse to let someone else write your last page.